Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Stephanie and I appreciate y'all stopping by. Since today is September 1st, I now consider it spooky season, which is hands down my favorite time of year. So in honor of that, today I will be showing y'all how I made these 7 easy Halloween decor DIYs that I'm going to be using to give my bedroom a little spooky touch this year. I hope y'all enjoy the video, and if you do, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Let's go ahead and jump into the first DIY. For this project, I used one of these cream-colored pumpkins from Walmart. I started by cutting off the little vine from the tip of the stem. Then used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the stem. I also went around the base of the stem to where the indentions in the section start with the ink chalk paint. I also took a pointed paintbrush and used it to paint a little ways down the indentions with the same ink chalk paint. Here is how the pumpkin looked once all the indentions and top were painted. I then took some Krylon chalky finished antiquing wax in the color dark vintage and a wax brush and brushed it onto the pumpkin, paying extra attention to the indentions between the sections. I brushed on the wax, then immediately took a paper towel and wiped off the excess. I continued to repeat this process over the entire pumpkin until I was happy with the way it looked. Next, I picked out 9 of these bats in different sizes from this 30 pack that I picked up at Five Below. Once I had all the bats picked out, I folded their wings along the scored edges so that they looked like they were in flight and then used hot glue to attach them to the pumpkin. I started attaching the bats at the bottom of the pumpkin and then continued adding bats in a diagonal direction all along the front. I put the smallest bats at the bottom and at the top of the pumpkin with the larger bats closer to the center to give it the illusion of the bats flying across the pumpkin. And that's it for this one. It was super easy to make and I love how it turned out. There was a very similar looking pumpkin on the Macy's website for $98 and I knew I could make myself one for much less. Let's go ahead and move on to DIY number 2. For this second project, I used one of these wooden plaques from the plus section at Dollar Tree. I started by using Rust-Oleum stain in the color Kona and stained the edges and back of the plaque. Next, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory to paint the front of the plaque. Then I cut out this design that I made on Cricut Design Space in black vinyl and cut off the bats on the right side of the horseman so that it would fit, and made sure the design was centered and applied it to the plaque. I will leave a link to the design in the description box below if you would like to do this project. I also want to mention that you can do this project without a vinyl machine by printing out the design and using Mod Podge to adhere it to the plaque, or by transferring it to the wood using carbon paper or the pencil transfer method and painting on the design. To finish off this project, I applied the set of bats that I cut off the design to the upper right side of the horseman, and this one was finished. I absolutely love how this sign turned out. The story of the Headless Horseman is one of my all-time favorites, so I thought this would be a cute little addition to my bedroom decor this spooky season. Moving right along to DIY number 3. For this next project, I used one of these bat Halloween garlands that I picked up at Walmart. I started by removing all the bats from the black ribbon. I did reuse this ribbon as a string for the garland. Once I had all the bats off the ribbon, I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the front of each of the bats with one coat just to get rid of the glitter. I'm not fond of the glitter, but if you are, you can totally skip this step. I used 1.5 of these wood beaded garlands from Dollar Tree for the wooden beads for the bat garland. I cut the end off the garland and removed the beads from the string. I used an upholstery needle to help thread the beads and bats back onto the black ribbon. You can also use a piece of tape on the end of the ribbon to help thread it through the holes if you don't have a needle. I tied a slip knot on one end of the ribbon so that the garland would have a hanger and so that the beads would not slip off the end. Then I started stringing the beads and bats back onto the ribbon. I went with the pattern of 6 wood beads, then a bat, and then 6 more wood beads, and repeated that pattern until I had the garland the length I wanted it to be. I made sure to start with 6 beads and end with 6 beads so that it would be nice and balanced. Once the garland was the desired length, I removed the needle and tied another slip knot at the end of the garland and cut off the excess ribbon. I did go ahead and use a lighter to singe the ends of the ribbon to keep it from coming unraveled, and that was it for this one. I'm super happy with how this garland turned out. I've seen these all over Pinterest and in stores, so I decided to make my own for just a few bucks. I want to take a few seconds here to mention that today's video is part of the Halloween challenge hosted by Chantel from Crafty Hints, Brenda from Rustic and Lace DIY, and Amanda from 6 Kids and a Glue Gun. If y'all haven't checked out these ladies, I highly recommend doing so. You won't be disappointed. I will leave a link to their channels in the description box below, along with a link to the playlist, so be sure to check it out for even more fun fall and Halloween decor inspiration. Now moving on to DIY number 4. For this project, I used a 12 by 12 inch screen art canvas that I picked up for 90 cents at Hobby Lobby, but you could use any frame you want. I started by very carefully using a flathead screwdriver and some pliers to remove all the staples from the back side of the frame so that I could remove the screen. Once the screen was removed, I stained the frame with Kona wood stain. Next, I took one of these 11 by 14 inch flat canvases from Dollar Tree and flipped it so the back side was facing up and placed the frame on top so that I could mark the inside and outside of the frame to cut the canvas to size. Once I had the canvas marked, I took an L-shaped ruler and a sharp utility knife and scored the back of the canvas and cut it to size. I then used a piece of sandpaper to clean up the cut edge of the canvas. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the entire canvas front and back. After the paint on the canvas was dry, I applied hot glue around the outside edges of the canvas and placed the frame on top. Then, to finish off this project, I took this vinyl decal that I created on Design Space and applied it to the center of the canvas. Again, I will leave a link to the design in the description box below if you want to recreate this project. You can also print this out with a regular printer and Mod Podge it onto the canvas or transfer it using carbon paper or the pencil method. I know I've said this about every project so far, but I really do love how this one turned out. I think it's so simple but makes such a statement. For this easy project, I used one of these plastic cloches from Dollar Tree. I used Waverly chalk paint in the color ink to paint the base of the cloche with 2 coats. Next, I took one of these styrofoam half circles from Hobby Lobby and carefully cut a little off the bottom so that it would fit inside the cloche with the top on. Once I had it cut to size, I painted it with 1 coat of the ink chalk paint. Then I took a skewer stick and used a pair of miter shears to cut 3 pieces at varying lengths. I then painted these 3 pieces with the chalk paint. Next, I took 3 of the smallest bats from the same pack of bats that I used in the first DIY and painted the fronts and backs with 2 coats of the ink chalk paint. After all the paint was dry, I used hot glue to attach 1 bat to each of the sticks. I did find out that if you put the hot glue directly onto the stick and allow it to cool for a few seconds, it doesn't cause the back of the bat to bubble up. I used a generous amount of hot glue on the bottom of the styrofoam and placed it in the center of the bottom of the cloche. I then placed the 3 bats down into the styrofoam so that they would appear to be flying. I do want to recommend using a different type of foam because this kind is really hard to get the sticks down into. I did end up having to cut some of the sticks down to fit inside the cloche with the top on and then use some hot glue to secure the sticks in the styrofoam. I arranged the bats so that the tallest was in the back and the shortest was more towards what is going to be the front. Next, I took some Spanish moss from Dollar Tree and hot glued it to the styrofoam to help cover up the foam and the skewer sticks. I definitely recommend using finger protectors for this step. After I had the moss in place, I trimmed up any of the wild and excess moss so that I could put the top back on the cloche. Then, to finish up this project, I placed the top back on the cloche and trimmed up any moss that happened to escape from the inside. I did end up using the end of a small paintbrush to help put the wings of the bat back in place. I think this one turned out super cute. It's another simple decor piece, but I think it looks lovely on a cabinet or even on a tiered tray. Moving on to my personal favorite of the video, DIY number 6. For this project, I used a 16 by 20 inch canvas from the plus section at Dollar Tree. I started by carefully using a flathead screwdriver and a pair of pliers to remove all the staples from the back of the canvas so I could remove it from the wooden frame. Once I had all the staples removed, I removed the canvas from the frame and set the frame aside. Next, I flipped the canvas over and flattened it out so that I would be working on the front side. I took a 10.5 inch plate from Walmart, but you could use any round object you have on hand, and placed it upside down in the center of the canvas. I then took Waverly chalk paint in the color ink and painted all around the plate, holding it in place so that I would have a perfect circle once it was removed. While I was painting, I tried not to get too much paint in any one area. I wanted some of the white canvas showing through in several places. If I did happen to get too much paint in one area, I simply took a baby wipe and took off some of the paint while it was still wet. Once I was happy with the way the canvas looked, I carefully removed the plate while the paint was still a little wet and took a paper towel and went around the outside of the circle to blend the edges and smudge the moon a bit to make it look a little more organic. Going back to the frame, I went ahead and used a flathead screwdriver and some pliers to remove the 4 staples in each of the corners of the front of the frame. I did end up flipping the frame over and putting a staple in each of the 4 corners on the back side to help hold it together. Next, I centered the frame so that the moon was in the center and used a small dab of hot glue in each of the corners to tack the canvas in place so I could flip it over and staple it to the frame. You don't have to use staples to attach the canvas to the frame. You could use hot glue and it would work just as well. Once I had all the staples in place, I took a sharp utility knife and carefully cut away all the excess canvas by cutting along the outside of the staples. Then I took 8 bats of varying sizes from the same pack of bats that I used in the first DIY and bent their wings and arranged them on the canvas to look like they were flying across the moon. Again, I put the smaller bats closer to the top and bottom of the moon and the larger bats on the moon. When I was happy with the placement of the bats, I used a small dab of hot glue to attach them to the canvas. I found that it is much easier to apply the glue directly to the canvas and allow it to cool for a few seconds before putting the bats on top so they don't bubble. Then, to finish off this project, since it will be hanging above my bed, I put a large sawtooth hanger in the center of the top back of the frame. I am beyond thrilled with how this project turned out. I've been waiting to make this one for a long time, and I really don't know why it's took so long. This has to be my favorite project out of all of today's projects. Let me know in the comments below which one is your favorite. For this project, I used one of these 18-inch wire wreath forms from Dollar Tree. First, I used some wire cutters to cut out one section of the wreath. I made sure to cut as close to the inside of the crossbar as possible. Then I cut a little bit in front of the next crossbar to completely remove this section of the wreath. Next, on the side that I cut in front of the crossbar, I went ahead and cut the crossbars to completely remove them so I would have one extra long section of the wreath. This is what it should look like once the section has been removed. I pinched the 3 pieces of wire together on one end of the wreath to form the bottom tip of the moon, and used some floral wire to hold the 3 pieces together. I then repeated the same step on the other side of the wreath to create the tip of the top of the moon. Here is how the wreath form should look once the ends of the moon are shaped. I used some white cotton craft cord from Hobby Lobby to wrap the moon frame. This is what I had on hand, but I would recommend using some sort of black cording or yarn. I started at one tip of the moon and applied some hot glue and pinched the cord together to close up the tip, and continued to wrap the wreath form using hot glue as needed to hold the cord in place until it was completely wrapped. It did take almost the entire roll of cording to wrap this form. Once the moon was completely wrapped, I took some Waverly chalk paint in the color ink and painted the entire piece, doing my best to cover all the white areas. Next, I took these letters from Dollar General and painted them front and back with Waverly chalk paint in the color ink. After all the paint was completely dry, I placed the letters on the left side of the moon where I wanted them to be and used hot glue to hold them in place. I used hot glue and it's held up great, but if you wanted to be extra cautious, you could use a stronger adhesive like E6000 or super glue. Next, I used 3 of these felt bats that I picked up last year, I think on Amazon. I'll leave a link below if I can find them again. I picked out 2 of the large bats and 1 of the small bats and arranged them how I thought they looked best on the wreath. If you can't find these bats or something similar, you could make your own out of black felt by printing out a template and cutting them out of the felt. I took a small piece of clear fishing line, but you could use clear thread, and hot glued it to the back of the small bat's head and cut off the excess line. Then I used hot glue to glue the large bats to the back of the wreath form. I put the glue on the tips of the wings where they were in contact with the wreath to hold the bats in place. Again, you could use a stronger adhesive if you wanted to. Then, to finish off this wreath, I measured how long I wanted the small bat to hang from the tip of the moon and cut the fishing line to size, then used hot glue to attach the bat to the tip of the moon, and this one's finished. I could not be happier with how this wreath turned out. I know it's only one color, but I think the different shades of blacks look so chic and classy. I'm also quite fond of the shape of the moon. It's a bit creepy looking in itself. Here is one final look at all of today's Halloween decor projects. I am absolutely thrilled with how all of these turned out, and I can't wait to decorate my bedroom with them in the next couple of days. If you can't tell, I love bats, and that's probably how I'm going to be doing a lot of my personal Halloween decor this year. Which one of these projects is your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Mine has to be the bat and full moon canvas print, but I truly love them all. I want to thank each and every one of you for stopping by today, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up. It really does help me out here on YouTube, and if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, what are you waiting for? Click that button and stick around for a little while. I have tons of fun projects on the way. Please don't forget to go check out the host of today's challenge. Their channels will be linked in the description box below, as well as a link to the playlist for even more fall and Halloween decor inspiration. I'll see y'all next time.